There are moments in life when a single question spoken aloud is enough to change the fate of hundreds of people. That night, on a transcontinental flight across the United States from Los Angeles to New York, the passenger cabin was immersed in the familiar stillness of an overnight flight. The cabin lights were dimmed, the seatback screens played movies that no one was really watching. The steady, low hum of the engines lulled people into a half-awake, half-asleep state, where time seemed to stretch endlessly. Then suddenly the captain's voice came over the intercom. It was no longer the calm, routine tone passengers were used to. It was not a courteous greeting or a weather update. The voice was short, firm, and carried something wrong. Ladies and gentlemen, if there is anyone on board who has flown an aircraft under combat conditions, please notify a flight attendant immediately. Just one sentence, but it was enough to freeze the entire cabin. Eyes that had been closed snapped open. Some passengers lifted their heads, not yet understanding what was happening. Some gripped the armrests tightly. Some turned to look at the person beside them as if hoping that person would stand up. But no one did. For the first few seconds, there was only silence. A heavy, suffocating silence, thick and dense, as if the air itself had been drained from the cabin. In the Economy Plus section near the front, but not special enough to be first class, a man remained seated. His name was Daniel Brooks, 42 years old. He wore a worn gray hoodie, dark jeans, and ordinary sneakers, no different from millions of other Americans. No suit, no expensive watch. Nothing suggested he was the person this cabin desperately needed. If you glanced at him, you wouldn't remember his face a few seconds later. Daniel was that kind of person, the kind who is easily overlooked, the kind the crowd doesn't notice. He leaned back against his seat, his eyes half closed. Before that voice came over the intercom, he had been thinking about his son, Ethan, a 9-year-old boy who loved basketball, hated math homework, and always asked questions Daniel didn't always have answers to. Before boarding the plane, Daniel had left a voice message for his son, a small habit he never skipped. "Hey, buddy, Dad's boarding the plane now. Listen to Grandma while I'm gone, okay? I'll be home soon." He didn't say much. He never had. But with Ethan, every word mattered. That message was still on his phone. And now, as the question echoed through the cabin, Daniel opened his eyes. He didn't look around right away. He looked down at his hands. Those hands had once gripped a control stick tens of thousands of feet in the air, in darkness, amid turbulence and flashing warning lights. Those hands had once kept a machine weighing dozens of tons from plunging into the ocean. And yet those same hands, for the past 9 years, had only been used to tie his son's shoes, fix a leaking faucet, and flip pancakes every Saturday morning. Daniel Brooks had left the sky nearly a decade ago, not because he no longer loved it, but because there was something he loved more. His wife had died in a traffic accident on a winter evening. One phone call, one moment, and his world collapsed. From that day on, Daniel was no longer a man living for himself. He became a father. He left the military, left the cockpit, left the sunrises seen from above the clouds. He chose the ground. He chose bedtime stories. He chose morning school drop-offs. He chose stability, the one thing the sky never promised. And he had kept that promise for 9 years, until tonight. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, more urgent this time. No explanation, no reassurance, only an emphasis that they needed someone with real combat flight experience, and the time was running out. Daniel took a deep breath. He knew exactly what that question meant. He knew what they were facing. And he also knew that if no one stood up, the chances of everyone on board making it home were painfully slim. Around him, passengers began to whisper. Some murmured prayers, some shook their heads, some looked around as if waiting for someone else, someone who looked more like a hero, to appear. Daniel looked toward the front of the cabin. No one stood. In that moment, he thought of Ethan, of the promise to always come home. He had built a peaceful life by staying far away from danger. And then, he thought of the 243 people on this plane, people who also had families, people who also had someone waiting for them at home. Daniel knew that if he stood up, no one could guarantee he would return. But if he didn't, he would have to live the rest of his life with the question, what if? He placed his hand on the seatbelt latch, and in the moment when the entire cabin was still hesitating, the man no one had noticed began to prepare to stand up. The seatbelt clicked softly, a sound so small that almost no one noticed it. But to Daniel Brooks, it was the sound of a line being crossed. He didn't jump to his feet. He wasn't hurried. He didn't move like someone seeking attention. Daniel stood up slowly, as if rising from the quiet, stable life he had fought to preserve for so many years. The gray hoodie was slightly wrinkled. His shoulders were broad, but not showy. His posture was steady, the posture of someone accustomed to pressure, even as the cabin began to stir like water disturbed beneath the surface. Eyes turned toward him, some curious, some anxious, and some skeptical. A few passengers glanced briefly, then looked away as if their minds immediately dismissed the possibility that this man could be the answer to the life or death call they had just heard. Daniel took a deep breath. "Excuse me," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear and distinct. A flight attendant stopped in front of him. She was very young, her professional smile frozen at the corners of her mouth. In her eyes, Daniel saw something he had grown used to seeing throughout his life. Caution. "Yes, sir?" she asked. Daniel met her gaze without flinching. "I can help," he said. "I've flown combat aircraft." There was no gasp, no sigh of relief, just a brief pause, then murmurs rippled through the cabin like wind moving through trees. A man in first class leaned into the aisle. He wore an expensive polo shirt, and a heavy metal watch gleamed on his wrist. "What did you say?" he asked, a hint of mockery in his voice. "You're a pilot?" Daniel didn't turn around. He addressed the flight attendant. "I served in the U.S. Navy," he said. "FA-18 pilot." She blinked. Once. Twice. "Do you have any identification?" she asked, gentle but firm. Daniel shook his head. "No," he said. "I left the military nearly 10 years ago. I don't carry it anymore." In that moment, Daniel felt the shift in the air with absolute clarity. The fragile spark of hope that had just ignited wavered instantly. He saw the flight attendant's eyes flick briefly from his face to his simple clothes, then to the name tag on her chest, as if she were searching for a polite reason to end the conversation. "Sir," she began, "we truly appreciate your willingness to help, but—" Daniel interrupted, not rudely, but with a low, measured, steady voice. "The aircraft is experiencing a flight control system failure," he said. "If I'm not mistaken, they've already lost at least one flight control computer, possibly two." The flight attendant froze. Daniel continued, placing each sentence carefully like pieces of a puzzle laid out on a table. "If the remaining backup system continues to degrade, the pilots will soon lose stable feedback from the controls. At that point, they'll be forced to fly manually." He looked directly into her eyes. "And that's not something civilian pilots are trained to do under these conditions." The cabin went silent. Not because everyone fully understood what he was saying, but because they felt it. The way he spoke didn't sound like guesswork, didn't sound like someone trying to appear necessary. He spoke as if he had been there before. Another passenger stood up, a middle-aged woman with streaks of gray in her hair, her expression strikingly calm. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the murmurs. "I don't know anything about airplanes," she said, "but I do know when someone is analyzing a truly dangerous situation." She looked at Daniel. "And he isn't panicking." The man in first class let out a short laugh. "You're just listening to him talk," he said. "Listening doesn't mean understanding. We can't just let a stranger—" "Time is running out," Daniel said, turning for the first time to look directly at him. Not angrily, not aggressively, just stating a bare, undeniable fact. "If I'm wrong," Daniel continued, "letting me speak to the pilots won't make things worse." He paused. "But if I'm right, then not listening could mean that no one here ever makes it home." No one spoke. The flight attendant swallowed, then nodded. "Please wait here," she said, lifting the intercom phone and moving quickly toward the cockpit. Daniel stood in the aisle. 243 people were looking at him. He felt their stares like an invisible weight. Some placed their hope in him. Some doubted him. Some were so afraid they desperately hoped he wouldn't be the only answer. In that moment, Daniel thought of Ethan. He thought of sitting beside his son's bed at night, listening to stories about school. He thought of the eager eyes whenever he promised, "We'll go to the park this weekend." He had left the sky to protect those moments. And now, the sky was calling him back, in a way he could no longer pretend not to hear. The flight attendant returned. This time her voice was different. "The first officer wants to speak with you," she said. "Right now." Daniel nodded. He walked forward down the narrow aisle between rows of seats filled with watching eyes. As he passed the man in first class, the man avoided his gaze. Daniel didn't slow down. He knew that from this moment on, nothing would be the same. Because when someone who has been invisible decides to stand up, the world has no choice but to see them. The cockpit door closed behind Daniel with a dry, metallic click. To the passengers outside the cabin, it was just a slight sound amid countless worries. But to Daniel, it was the final boundary between being an ordinary passenger and bearing the life or death responsibility for 243 people. Inside the cockpit, everything was different. There were no soft lights, no whispered voices, only the cold blue glow of electronic displays, several of them flickering abnormally, and a faint smell of heated plastic, a smell Daniel recognized instantly, the smell of trouble. The captain was slumped to one side in his seat, his forehead hastily wrapped with a white cloth now stained dark red. He was unconscious, his breathing steady but labored. The first officer, a much younger man, had both hands clenched tightly around the control yoke, his knuckles white from the pressure. He looked up as Daniel entered. In his eyes was a mix of emotions, fear, exhaustion, and a fragile sliver of hope. "You didn't even dare to name." "I'm Ryan," the first officer said quickly, his voice hoarse with strain. "You're Daniel, right?" Daniel nodded. "Tell me what happened," he said, his voice low and steady. Ryan swallowed, forcing himself to control his breathing. "About 40 minutes ago, the flight control system started throwing faults. At first it was low-level warnings, then one flight control computer dropped offline." He pointed to the panel. 2 red lights were glowing steadily. "The second one failed not long after. We're running on the last remaining system." Daniel stepped forward, his eyes scanning the displays. He didn't touch anything. Not yet. "And then?" he asked. "We hit severe turbulence," Ryan said. "The aircraft lost altitude suddenly. The captain didn't have time to fasten his seatbelt." Daniel glanced at the unconscious man beside him, then turned back to the controls. "Do you feel the difference in the controls?" asked. Ryan nodded immediately. "It's unstable. delayed response. Sometimes it's overly sensitive. Sometimes it barely responds at all. Daniel nodded. No surprise. He had heard these descriptions before. In other cockpits, at other altitudes, in situations where being a single beat late meant there was no second chance. "Have you engaged the backup control mode?" Daniel asked. Ryan shook his head. "The checklist says it's a last resort. I've never done it outside of a simulator." Daniel rested a hand on the captain's seat frame and leaned slightly forward to get a clearer view of the center panel. "Ryan," he said without turning around, "this isn't a last resort anymore." Ryan said nothing. Daniel pointed to a cluster of little noticed switches mounted lower near the center console. "That's the backup control module," he said. "Once you activate it, you completely cut off the electronic flight control system. No assistance, no automatic protections." Ryan followed his gesture, eyes widening. "You'd be flying completely manually?" "Yes," Daniel replied. "Like flying a machine weighing hundreds of tons without a safety net." Ryan swallowed hard. "And if it doesn't work?" Daniel turned, meeting Ryan's eyes for the first time. "Then we're no worse off than we are right now," he said. "But if it does work, it's our only chance." Ryan remained silent for a long moment. Beyond the cockpit windows was nothing but dense darkness. No horizon, no city lights. Only the Atlantic Ocean somewhere below, unseen yet ever present in every pilot's mind. "Have you ever done this before?" Ryan asked, his voice quieter. Daniel didn't answer right away. He remembered other cockpits, flashing warnings, moments when systems failed one by one, leaving nothing but raw physics and human hands. "Yes," he said. "Not with this aircraft, but the principles are the same." He paused. "The most important thing is, don't panic. The aircraft always tells you what it needs. You just have to listen." Ryan took a deep breath. "Can you stay here?" he asked. "Help me?" Daniel nodded. "I'm here," he said. "We'll do this together." Ryan reached toward the backup control switch, then hesitated. His hand trembled slightly. Daniel placed a hand on Ryan's shoulder. Not gripping, just enough to let him know he wasn't alone. "Trust your hands," Daniel said. "Trust what you've been trained to do." Ryan closed his eyes for a second, then opened them. He flipped the switch. For the first moment, nothing happened. Then the controls suddenly went light, almost lifeless. The aircraft shuddered and lost altitude faster than expected. Daniel's stomach tightened on instinct. "Hold the nose," Daniel said immediately. Ryan pulled back, a little too hard. Daniel adjusted at once. "Easy," he said. "We don't force it. We persuade it." Seconds stretched into something that felt endless. Then, the controls stiffened again. Feedback returned. Not perfect, not smooth, but real. "Oh my God," Ryan whispered. It's responding." Daniel allowed himself a slow exhale. "See," he said, "it hasn't given up." Ryan smiled, a crooked smile, caught somewhere between relief and fear. "Thank you," he said. I don't know what I would have done if you weren't here." Daniel didn't reply. He stared forward into the endless darkness ahead. He knew the most challenging part was still to come, because keeping a dying machine in the air is difficult, but bringing it safely back to the ground, that is the actual test. And that test was coming fast. Inside the cockpit, the hard-won silence lasted only a few minutes. Not because the aircraft was safe, but because the danger had taken on a new form. Daniel stood behind Ryan, his eyes tracking every flickering number on the instrument panel. The backup system was functioning, but it was functioning in a way that wasn't sustainable. Every response lagged by a beat. Every correction required more effort than before. "Hydraulic pressure is dropping," Ryan said, his voice controlled but unable to hide the concern beneath it. "Not fast, but steady." Daniel nodded. He had seen this kind of decline before. Quiet, undramatic, but ruthless, like someone slowly bleeding out. "It's not going to stop," Daniel said. "The only question is how much time we have left." Ryan swallowed, his eyes never leaving the display. "If it keeps this rate, about an hour and a half before we fall below minimum levels." Daniel calculated silently. Distance, speed, altitude, wind, direction. "An hour and a half," he repeated. "That's not enough." Ryan turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" "We can't stay airborne that long on this system," Daniel said. "The longer we fly, the faster we burn through hydraulic pressure, and once it drops too low, the controls will become so heavy they'll be impossible to manage." Ryan said nothing. He understood. "We need to land sooner," Daniel continued, "at an airport with a long runway, full emergency services." Ryan checked the navigation map. Bright points appeared on the screen. "Denver," he said after a few seconds. "That's our best option." Daniel nodded. "Call them," he said. "Declare an emergency." When Ryan spoke into the radio, his voice was different this time. No trembling, no hesitation. Perhaps because, for the first time since this ordeal began, he wasn't alone. Out in the passenger cabin, the atmosphere was slowly changing. The scattered murmurs were gone. The whispered questions had faded. Only waiting remained. Flight attendant Jennifer walked the aisle, checking seat belts and reassuring passengers one by one. Her smile was still there, but her eyes couldn't hide the tension. Some passengers closed their eyes in prayer. Some gripped their armrests tightly. Some pretended to watch movies, as if not looking directly at fear might make it disappear. In first class, the man who had once openly doubted Daniel now sat motionless. The earlier arrogance had evaporated, replaced by an ashen face and eyes fixed on the seat back ahead of him. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Back in the cockpit, Daniel began to feel the change in the controls more clearly. They were heavier. Not suddenly, but gradually, bit by bit, like the aircraft was demanding a price for every movement. "Pressure at 65%, Ryan reported. Daniel nodded. "We'll fly until we can't," he said. "And when that moment comes, we need to be in the right place." Ryan glanced at him. "You talk as if you've already accepted the worst-case scenario." Daniel didn't look back. "No," he said. "I'm just preparing for it." A long silence followed. Then Ryan spoke, his voice lower. "My wife is pregnant," he said. "I took this flight so I could make it home for her doctor's appointment." Daniel turned toward him. "First child?" he asked. Ryan nodded, offering a faint smile. "We don't even know if it's a boy or a girl yet." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "I have a son," he said, 9 years old, and I promised him I'd come home." Ryan looked at him. This time, there was no distance between them. "Then," Ryan said softly, "we have the same reason." Daniel nodded. "Yes," he said, "and that's why we're going to land this aircraft." Outside the cockpit windows, the first lights of land began to appear on the navigation display. Denver lay ahead. "Pressure at 55%, Ryan said. "Control response is even slower." Daniel stepped forward. "Ryan," he said, "it's time." Ryan turned to him. "You mean?" "I need to take direct control," Daniel said. "This system is only going to get heavier. You've never flown under conditions like this." Ryan didn't argue. He looked at the instruments, at the numbers steadily falling, then at Daniel. "Are you sure?" he asked. Daniel placed his hand on the control yoke, feeling the weight transmit through every joint in his fingers. "I've never been more sure," he said. Ryan took a deep breath, then nodded. "You have the aircraft," he said solemnly. Daniel sat down in the captain's seat. In that moment, he felt exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just flying a machine. He was holding the lives of 243 people in his hands. He was returning to the sky he had once left, not out of desire, but out of responsibility. Out there, no one knew exactly what was happening, but there was one thing everyone could feel. The aircraft was descending, and everything was entering a phase where there was no room for mistakes. When Daniel wrapped his hands around the control yoke, he didn't think about returning to the sky. He thought only about keeping it there. The controls were heavier than he expected. Not the weight of metal, but the weight of something slowly refusing to cooperate. Every adjustment required more force. Every response arrived a beat late, as if the aircraft were telling him, "I'm running out of strength." "Hydraulic pressure at 48%, Ryan reported, his voice steady but low. "We're below minimum now." Daniel didn't respond right away. He felt every vibration travel up his arms, into his shoulders, into his back. His body adjusted automatically, like an old reflex that had been dormant for years. "Continue," he said. "Hold the rhythm." Outside Denver was clearer on the navigation display. The runway lines were still blurred, but clear enough for Daniel to picture what awaited them ahead. A single chance, with no second attempt. In the passenger cabin, the tension was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Jennifer walked the aisle one last time. She no longer spoke much. She simply placed a hand on the back of each seat, nodding gently, a wordless way of saying, "We're almost there." A child began to cry, then was pulled tightly into a mother's arms. A man closed his eyes, lips moving in silent prayer. In first class, the man who had once doubted Daniel now sat frozen, hands clasped together, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood. If this didn't work, there would be no next time. Inside the cockpit, warning lights continued to blink. Not frantically, not chaotically, just steadily, like a countdown clock. 40%, Ryan said. Daniel nodded, his eyes fixed forward. "We're committing to an early approach," he said. "No holding patterns, no corrections. Once we're descending, we're going all the way." Ryan swallowed hard. "You're sure?" Daniel looked out at the city lights beginning to appear beneath a thin layer of clouds. "There's no more sure," he said. "Only do." He adjusted the thrust, keeping the speed higher than usual. Every civilian instinct would have resisted it. But Daniel wasn't flying by the book. He was flying by the experience of wounded machines, aircraft that had come home in worse condition than this. "Pressure at 35%, Ryan said, his voice trembling slightly. "Prepare the announcement," Daniel said. "When I say brace, say it immediately." Ryan nodded. Outside, the runway appeared like a strip of light cutting through the darkness. Fire trucks, ambulances, red and blue lights lined both sides, a sight Daniel had seen before, but never from this position. 1,000 feet, Ryan called. Daniel felt the weight pressing down on his shoulders. Sweat ran down his spine, muscles locked tight. He didn't breathe fast, didn't gasp. He breathed deep, slow, steady. 900. The aircraft shuddered slightly as if protesting. 800. Daniel corrected the rudder. A small movement, precise. 700. The controls nearly seized. Daniel clenched his jaw and pushed through. 600. He knew that trying to be smooth now would cost them control. He chose rough, practical, effective. 500. Daniel made his final decision, a technique he had learned in the military, reserved for aircraft no longer capable of being pretty. Only survival mattered. Hold speed, he said. Don't flare early. 400. Ryan looked at him, eyes filled with fear and trust. 300. Brace, Daniel said. Ryan activated the cabin announcement. Brace for impact! Brace for impact! The words echoed through the cabin. Passengers bent forward, clutched their loved ones, and tightened their seatbelts until it was painful. 200. Daniel pulled back on the yoke. Not too hard, not too soft. Exactly as his body told him. 100. The runway rushed up. 50. The main wheels hit. One bounce, then a second. The screech of rubber tore through the air. Daniel deployed reverse thrust. The engines roared like wounded beasts. The aircraft shook violently. Brakes! Daniel shouted. Ryan applied them. The remaining hydraulic pressure drained away, a final groan from the system, but the wheels held. Speed dropped. Slower. Slower. The runway slid past the windows, and then it stopped. Silence. A strange silence, unlike anything before. No alarms, no engines, just ragged breathing and pounding hearts. Daniel didn't release the controls right away. He closed his eyes for a second. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw his son's face, the gap-toothed smile, the voice at bedtime. Dad, remember to come home? He opened his eyes. We landed, Ryan said, his voice breaking. Daniel let out a long, trembling breath. We're back on solid ground, he said softly. In the passenger cabin, it took a few seconds for people to understand what had happened. Then came the cries, the laughter, the prayers, strangers embracing one another. Jennifer collapsed into a seat, tears spilling freely. Outside, fire trucks began to move in. In the cockpit, Daniel finally released the yoke, his hands numb. He had done what he needed to do, and more than anything else, he had kept his promise. After the wheels came to a complete stop on the runway, it took a few breaths before people dared to believe they were still alive. There was no immediate applause, no cheering, only a prolonged silence, so fragile it felt like it might shatter if anyone moved too suddenly. Then a sob broke out somewhere toward the back of the cabin. Then another. Then another. The silence fractured into unmistakably human sounds. Crying, laughter through tears, whispered, "Thank God," gasps of breath like people being pulled back from the edge of a cliff. Jennifer leaned against the back of a seat, her head bowed. She no longer tried to hide her tears. Years as a flight attendant had trained her for emergencies, for evacuation procedures, for staying calm. But no one trains you for the moment when you realize you have just survived something that should have killed you. In the cockpit, Daniel remained seated. He didn't stand up right away, didn't remove his headset, didn't turn to look at Ryan. His hand rested lightly on the control yoke, as if letting go might cause everything to slip out of reality. Ryan was the one who broke the silence. We did it, he said, his voice thick and hoarse. You saved everyone. Daniel shook his head very slightly. No, he said. We did it. Ryan looked at him, then nodded, a slow, heavy nod, as if he finally understood what that meant. No one gets through moments like this alone. Outside, fire trucks and ambulances had surrounded the aircraft. Red and blue lights reflected off the metal fuselage, forming slow-moving streaks of color. The cockpit door opened. A rush of cold air flooded in, carrying the smell of fuel, burned rubber, and survival. Medical personnel quickly carried the captain out on a stretcher. He was still unconscious, but his pulse was stable. Another chance had been given. Daniel stood up, his legs slightly unsteady. The tightness in his body began to release, revealing the exhaustion that had been building for so long. He stepped out of the cockpit. The cabin lights were now fully on. Everyone turned to look at him. Not the earlier looks of scrutiny, not suspicion, not prejudice. These were the eyes of people who had just realized that this ordinary man had brought them home. A woman stood in the aisle, her hands trembling as she held a rosary. She offered it to Daniel without saying a word. Daniel accepted it and nodded gently. Another man simply placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezed lightly, his eyes red. No words were needed. In first class, the man who had once openly doubted Daniel stood up. He didn't step into the aisle right away. As if gathering his courage, he finally moved forward. "Daniel," he said, his voice much lower than before. I owe you an apology." The cabin grew quiet again. "I said things I shouldn't have," he continued. "I let my arrogance and my prejudice blind me. If people had listened to me, maybe—" He stopped, unable to continue. Daniel looked at him. No anger, no triumph, just fatigue. "What matters," Daniel said slowly, "is that we're all still here." The man nodded, his gaze dropping. "Thank you," he said, "for doing the right thing, even when no one believed you." Daniel didn't respond right away. He thought of the years he had been overlooked, the times he had to prove twice as much just to be trusted half as far. He thought of his son and the world that boy would grow up in. "Next time," Daniel said, his voice low but clear, "remember that you don't have to look like a hero to do something heroic." The man looked up. Something deeper than embarrassment flickered in his eyes. Daniel moved on. As passengers evacuated the aircraft one by one, Daniel was the last to leave. He walked down the metal stairs, the cold Denver air seeping into his skin. Under the floodlights, he looked tiny compared to the massive aircraft behind him. But everyone there knew. This was the man who had kept it in the air. An airline representative approached, gripping Daniel's hand tightly, offering words of thanks that Daniel heard as if through a thin fog. He nodded politely, but his mind was elsewhere. He needed to make a call. Inside the terminal, Daniel found a quiet corner. His phone battery was down to just a few %. He dialed, his heart pounding faster than it had on final approach. The phone rang twice. "Dad?" Ethan's voice came through, still sleepy. "Why are you calling so late?" Daniel closed his eyes and swallowed hard. "I'm okay, buddy," he said. "I'm just running a little late." "Were you scared?" Ethan asked softly. Daniel thought of standing up in the cabin, of the heavy controls, of the runway lights rushing toward him. "Yes," he said honestly. "But I had you to come back to." There was silence on the other end for a few seconds. "I'm proud of you," Ethan said. Daniel smiled as tears fell onto the cold terminal floor. "When will you be home?" Ethan asked. "Very soon," Daniel replied. "I just took a bit of a detour." After the call ended, Daniel sat still. Through the large glass windows, the night sky was beginning to fade. Dawn was coming. He thought about the sky, the thing he had left but never truly lost. And for the first time in a long while, he understood something clearly. He didn't return to the sky to find himself. He brought himself back from the sky. That morning, the first sunlight filtered through the airport's large glass windows, casting a pale golden glow on the floor. Daniel sat alone on an extended bench, both hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, yet barely taking a sip. After a night in which time had been stretched to its breaking point, everything suddenly felt slower. The hurried footsteps, the steady announcements of departing flights, strangers passing by, unaware that just hours earlier they had nearly ceased to exist. Daniel looked out through the glass. The aircraft was still there, motionless, surrounded by ground crews and technical vehicles. A massive machine that had roared and trembled, now lying quiet, almost as if asleep. It struck him then. Some things are strong not because they never break, but because they remain standing after nearly falling apart. Ryan approached, carrying 2 fresh cups of coffee. He set one down beside Daniel. "You should drink something," Ryan said with a tired smile. "We've been through a long journey." Daniel smiled faintly. "Yeah," he replied, "longer than I expected." They sat together in silence for a few minutes. There are moments when words become unnecessary. "You know," Ryan said quietly, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said in the cockpit." Daniel turned toward him. "About what?" "About listening to the aircraft," Ryan replied, "and listening to yourself." Daniel nodded. "There are times," he said, "when we're taught to trust the systems, the procedures, everything around us. But when it all collapses, the only thing left is the human being." Ryan looked at him, his expression serious. "And you believed in that," Ryan said, "even when no one believed in you." Daniel didn't answer. He thought of the moment he stood up in the cabin surrounded by unfamiliar faces, of the feeling of being weighed, judged, doubted, not because of his words, but because of who he was. He was used to it. But being used to it didn't mean it didn't hurt. After a while, Daniel stood up. He needed to step outside and take a breath. The cool morning air touched his skin, carrying the scent of metal and fuel, the smell of airports, the smell of farewells and reunions. His phone vibrated in his pocket. A message from his mother. "Son, I saw the news. I know you don't like attention, but I've never been more proud of you." Daniel smiled, a tiny smile, a very private one. He thought of the path he had chosen 9 years earlier, leaving the military, leaving the sky, leaving the thing that made his heart race the most, to hold on to something more important. Back then, he had asked himself, "Am I giving up who I am?" Now, he had his answer. No, he had never given up himself. He had only redefined who he was. A father, first and foremost. A human being, always ready to stand up when needed. A few hours later, Daniel walked out through the arrivals gate, where other passengers waited for their connecting flights. Some recognized him. Some looked a moment longer, then turned away. There was no applause, no cameras shoved into his face. And Daniel liked it that way. He didn't need to be remembered as a hero. He just needed to go home. When his plane landed in his city, Daniel saw Ethan behind the security barrier, bouncing excitedly in his grandmother's arms. The boy spotted him first. "Dad!" That single word tore through every remaining layer of restraint. Daniel dropped his bag, walked quickly, then ran. He dropped to his knees just as Ethan launched himself forward, small arms wrapping tightly around his neck. "I'm home," Daniel whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm home." "I knew it," Ethan said, his voice muffled against Daniel's jacket. "I knew you'd keep your promise." Daniel closed his eyes. In that moment, everything was exactly where it belonged. That evening, after a simple dinner and after the bedtime story, Daniel sat beside his son's bed, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. He placed a hand on Ethan's forehead, feeling the familiar warmth of his skin. He finally understood something he had never quite been able to name before. The promise he had made all those years ago was not a promise to avoid danger. It was a promise always to find his way back, even if that path led through storms, even if it carried him back into the sky. Daniel turned off the light and gently closed the door. Outside the window, the stars were shining, the same stars pilots once navigated by, the same stars fathers point out to their children and make wishes upon. He stood there for a long moment. Then he smiled. The story of that night's flight appeared on the morning news the next day. The anchor spoke in a smooth, practiced tone. The scrolling text at the bottom of the screen summarized the event in just a few short seconds. Aircraft experiences technical issue. Safe emergency landing. Passenger with aviation experience assists flight crew. There were no images of a shaking cockpit, no sweat running down a spine, no moment when the control yoke grew heavier in human hands. And there was no way to convey what it feels like when one person is forced to become the anchor for hundreds of others. Daniel watched the news that evening after putting Ethan to bed. He turned off the television before the segment ended, not because he was upset, only because he knew that what truly mattered had never been on the screen. It lived in tiny things, like the way Ethan held his hand a little tighter that night. Like how Daniel sat longer by his son's bed, listening to each steady breath, like the rare quiet inside himself, something he hadn't felt in many years. A few days later, Daniel returned to ordinary life. Mornings taking his son to school, afternoons working in front of a computer screen, evenings cooking simple meals, sometimes making the noodles Ethan liked. No one at the office looked at him differently. No one patted him on the back in the hallway. And Daniel found that everything was in perfect order, because the most significant moments in a person's life are rarely fully witnessed by outsiders. One weekend afternoon, as Daniel and Ethan sat together on the front steps, the boy suddenly asked, "Dad, when you were on the plane, did you think you were a hero?" Daniel turned to look at his son. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. He thought for a long moment before answering. "No," he said. "I just thought there was something that needed to be done." Ethan frowned. "But you saved a lot of people." Daniel smiled. "Maybe," he said, "but I didn't do it to be called anything." The boy was quiet for a moment, then nodded as if understanding in his own way. "So if something hard happens to me someday," Ethan said, "I just need to do what needs to be done too, right?" Daniel placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "That's right," he said. "And you don't have to be like anyone else." That night, when everything was quiet, Daniel sat alone on the porch. Above him, the sky stretched wide, the stars shining, the place that had once been his home. He thought about the years that had passed, about the decision to leave the sky, about the moment he returned, not for passion, but for responsibility. And for the first time, he understood something clearly. Life never asks us to be only one thing. We can be devoted fathers, and still be the ones who stand up when the world needs it. We can choose peace without losing the ability to face the storm. The days that followed, Daniel received a few emails, a brief thank you note from the airline, a message from a passenger who had found him through the flight manifest. "I didn't get the chance to say anything back then," the message read, "but because of you, I was able to go home and hold my child." Daniel read that email very slowly. He didn't reply right away, not because he didn't know what to say, but because there was no need to say much. He simply saved it, as a reminder that sometimes The most significant value of an action doesn't lie in the moment it happens, but in the quiet lives that are allowed to continue afterwards. Another evening, Ethan fell asleep early. Daniel stood by the window looking out at the distant city lights. He thought about the people on that flight, each with their own story, their own worries, their own place to return to. He couldn't remember all their faces, but he remembered the feeling when the plane came to a stop. The feeling of knowing that everything had been handed back to life. Daniel took a deep breath. He didn't know if he would ever face a moment like that again. Maybe not. Maybe that was the only time the sky would call his name in that way. But if that day ever came, he knew he wouldn't turn away. Not because he was a pilot, not because he had once been a soldier, but because he was a human being who understood this. Sometimes, courage isn't about charging forward, but about not stepping back when you are already standing in the right place. Daniel turned off the porch light and stepped inside. The small house was quiet and warm. A house filled with the steady breathing of a 9-year-old boy dreaming innocent dreams. He closed the door gently. Outside, the sky was still there. Vast. Silent. Waiting. But this time, Daniel no longer felt it calling him, because he understood. He didn't need to be in the sky to be himself. He only needed to be where someone was waiting for him to come home. Some stories don't end when the camera turns off. They continue to live within the people who passed through them. That night flight eventually became part of the past. The runway was cleared, the aircraft was moved into a hangar for inspection. Technical reports were written, signed, and filed away. On paper, everything had been handled. But in the hearts of those who were there that day, something had changed forever. A woman on the flight, who had sat by the window and prayed through the final minutes, returned home and held her son longer than usual. When the boy asked why, she didn't talk about the plane, the malfunction, or the fear. She simply said, "Because sometimes being able to hold your child is a privilege." Another man who had been seated in first class began paying more attention to the people he used to pass by without seeing. The delivery worker, the cleaner, the man in the gray hoodie is sitting alone in a cafe, not because he suddenly became a better person, but because he understood that you can't know someone's story just by looking at them. And Daniel Brooks, he went on living his life. No speeches, no stage. No title of hero is placed before his name. In the mornings, he still stood in the kitchen, making coffee while Ethan got ready for school. Still reminded his son not to forget his jacket. Still did the small things the world rarely calls extraordinary. But some nights, when the city had fallen asleep, Daniel lay in bed staring up at the ceiling in the dark. He no longer dreamed of cockpits the way he used to. No more jolting awake to the sound of blaring alarms. Instead, he thought about the moment he stood up, the moment the entire cabin fell silent, the moment he felt the weight of doubt, judgment, and fear in people's eyes, the moment he understood clearly. Standing up is not just an action, it is a choice. He could have stayed seated. He could have pretended not to hear. He could have waited for someone who looked more like a hero to step forward. But he didn't, and that taught him a lesson he had never quite named in all the years before. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is refusing to let fear dictate your actions. One evening, Ethan brought home a school assignment. The topic was, "Write about someone you admire." Daniel sat beside his son, quietly reading the still uneven handwriting. "I admire my dad," Ethan had written. "Not because he flew a plane, but because he always does the right thing, even when it's hard. Daniel folded the paper very carefully. He didn't say anything, but his chest tightened in the gentlest possible way. Perhaps that was the greatest reward of all. Not the thanks of strangers, not looks of admiration, but knowing that the child he was raising had understood the value of standing up for what is right. Out there, the world was still noisy. Prejudice still existed. Unfair questions were still asked every day. But somewhere, in tiny, very private moments, that story was still sending out quiet ripples. When someone hesitated, then chose to listen instead of judge. When someone reconsidered their own thoughts before speaking. When an ordinary person realized that they too could be a pillar, if needed. Daniel did not change the world. He never tried to. He simply did his part. In that moment, life asked it of him. And perhaps that is what lasts the longest. Not the story of a flight, but the story of human beings faced with a choice. We can turn away, or we can stand up. Not everyone who stands up is remembered by name, but each time someone does, the world shifts, even if only a little. Daniel turned off the living room light and walked into the bedroom. Ethan was fast asleep, hugging his familiar pillow. Daniel pulled the blanket up around him, then stood there for a moment, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. He whispered so softly that no one else could hear, "Sleep well. Tomorrow, everything continues." And it did. Life went on, but not the same as before. Because somewhere, in many people, something had been planted, something small but strong enough to remind them, don't rush to judge, don't rush to turn away, and never underestimate the power of an ordinary person when they choose to stand up. In the end, when the story has been fully told, when the life and death moments have receded into the past, what remains is not the roar of engines, not the flashing warning lights, and not the violent impact on the runway. What remains is silence. The silence that comes after people realize they have come very close to the final boundary. The silence that makes us look back at ourselves more slowly, more deeply. Daniel Brooks understands this clearly. He no longer thinks of himself as the man who flew that plane. He does not call himself a hero, and he does not want others to call him that either. Because for Daniel, the most critical moment was not when the wheels touched the ground, but when he placed his hand on the seatbelt latch and decided to stand up. That moment had no background music, no stage lights, just an ordinary person among hundreds of others facing a silent question. Do I do this? We often think that heroes are people who never hesitate, but the truth is the bravest people are those who hesitate deeply and still choose to step forward. Daniel hesitated. He thought about his son. He thought about the peaceful life he had worked so hard to build. He thought about the possibility that if he stood up, he might never come back. And yet, he still stood up. Not because he wasn't afraid, but because there are some things that, if left undone, leave behind a fear far greater. We live in a world where appearances often dictate how people are judged, easily measured in a matter of seconds, easily placed into simple, often cruel categories. A person in a suit is trusted. A person in a hoodie is doubted. A person who speaks loudly is noticed. A person who speaks slowly is dismissed. This story is not meant to accuse anyone, because if we are honest with ourselves, there have likely been moments when each of us has done the same. But it reminds us of one thing. We cannot honestly know the value of a person until life presents them in the right moment. Daniel did not become a different person after that night. He was simply seen more clearly. And perhaps the most essential thing this story leaves behind is not what he did, but what will we do when faced with a similar moment in our own lives? It may not be on an airplane. It may not be in a life or death situation. It may simply be when someone needs to be heard, when someone needs a voice to stand beside them. When someone is doubted and underestimated, the world is waiting to see whether anyone will step forward. Standing up is not always loud. Sometimes it is just a timely sentence, a small action, a decision not to turn away. Daniel taught us this. You do not need to search for greatness. You need not abandon what is right when it comes looking for you. That night he returned home, not with glory, but with a promise kept. And the next morning the sun rose as it always does. Children went to school, adults went to work. Life continued, so ordinary that almost no one noticed that. The world had been held together once more. Perhaps that is the quiet beauty of courage, not to be remembered, but so that others may continue living their lives. If you have stayed with this story until these final moments, perhaps your own heart has slowed by a beat as well. And if you felt something, even something tiny, hold on to it. Remember it when you meet someone you do not yet fully understand. Remember it when you face the choice to turn away or to stay. Remember it when you think you are just an ordinary person. Because sometimes it is ordinary people. What are the reasons the world does not fall apart? Thank you for listening to this story until the very end. If it made you think or helped you believe a little more in people, please share it. Someone out there may need to hear it right now. Don't forget to leave a comment with your thoughts. And if you'd like to continue walking with Deep Life Tales, where we tell stories of courage, humanity, and the moments that shape who we are, like, share, and subscribe to the channel, because every story that gets told, it is a way for us to understand one another better. And when we understand each other better, this world becomes just a little more worth living.